Well, I must not be doing too bad if you're here for week 3. And this week we're going to be talking about rest. And I'm really excited about this class. The last few classes that we taught were kind of very much nuts and bolts. And that's a lot of the stuff that I teach is, like I said, financial stewardship and things that are pretty practical and kind of the things that we do, like scheduling and that. But this week is a little bit different because we're going to be talking about rest. And, if you've walked out in the last couple weeks, maybe almost feeling overwhelmed because we're talking about all these things with time management and such, that's okay because this is really important. When I first taught this class for the first time, it was about 1.5 years ago. And we taught it, and it was part of a 2-week series that I did on work and rest. And I told the class that I did rest the first week because if they didn't like me, I wanted to make sure they got that one. I think this is a really important topic. But you guys have stuck with us, so we're going to cover this here in the 3rd week before we go on. All right, let's go ahead and open up in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for all the folks that have taken time out of their schedules to be here once again. So, Lord, I pray that you come and meet us here tonight, that your Spirit is here. God, that you just sit in this place with us, Lord, and you teach us as we go through this stuff tonight. Ask it all in your name. Amen. Amen. All right, so what we're going to cover tonight, so a couple things here. One, we're going to cover kind of why rest. Why is rest important? We'll then talk about the lack of rest. Just kind of touching on some stuff we talked about before about how difficult it is to rest in today's society and culture. God's plan for our rest. We'll talk about some views on time, which is a little different than we talked about God and time before. We'll talk about a couple of the words for time in the Bible. We're going to talk about living our life with margin, with some space. We'll talk about how to rest, so some practical ways of what does that look like. And then the last piece we'll talk about is the struggle to rest, because we know that any good thing that God has for us, Satan wants to oppose it. So we'll talk a little bit about that struggle. One of the reasons that I really like this class is that it is more theological, if you will. A lot of the stuff, like I say, that I teach is very hands-on, but this one really is all about Jesus. What we're going to be talking about here with rest, everything that we have, all these good things, are because of Jesus. So in Psalm 73:26, it says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart, my portion forever." What I believe is that every Christian can experience greater peace and rest by understanding Christ's completed work on the cross. What we're going to talk about and kind of come back to this theme here is that, when we rest, it's not because of our weakness, but because of God's strength. When we rest, it's not because our work is done, but because Christ finished the work on the cross. So we're going to kind of come back to this theme and talk about different examples, but this is a verse that I just want to kind of lay the groundwork that our rest does not come from things like we talked about last week. This isn't just something that you do and that you can do on your own. You can achieve rest because of who God is. So why is rest important? Well, the first one is that God commanded it. And he commanded it with the Sabbath. One of the first things that we see in the 10 Commandments is that God tells us to honor the Sabbath. And I think it's interesting because when you look in the Old Testament, there's so many laws and there's so many things that they talk about. But the 10 Commandments, they're God's top 10 list, right? These are the things that we can look and say, this is really important to him. And it's interesting that the Sabbath was one of those. Why is it that this was so important to God? I think that I'm really looking forward to the sermon series that Pastor Robert will be starting next week on the 10 Commandments and about how they tie in with relationship. Because that was something I was thinking about as I was putting together this material, about how when God gave us the Sabbath, he didn't do it as another thing to do. He did it because it was a gift and something that we can have a relationship with him. God wants us to experience that rest. So this is something that I'm really excited to see how Pastor Robert teaches this, because this is an important part that we need to understand, that the Sabbath isn't just something that we do or another law. There's a reason God did it, and it's because it just encourages that relationship with him. So there's 3 things that rest does for us. One, rest, it makes us recognize God, it allows us to know God, and it builds our trust in God. So 3 ways that it does this is recognizing God. When we're so busy and so caught up in just the tasks and the day-to-day, oftentimes it's hard for us to be able to kind of pull up and recognize where God's at. And then secondly, when we start to recognize God and we start to allow time for him in that relationship, That's what allows us to start to really know God and understand Him and His nature. And then the last piece here about it trusting, it builds our trust in God is important because it takes trust in order to rest. It takes trust to say, I can't do all this on my own, so I'm going to rest in the fact that God's going to help me with it. And this concept here kind of parallels the tithe. You know, I've said a few times as we've talked through things about how time kind of parallels a lot of things about money, a lot of things about our finance. And rest and the Sabbath have a similar parallel to the tithe. And I'll tell you kind of the two ways that I think it does that. One, the tithe is something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you think about it, you know, what financial planner is going to tell you that you should just give away with no expectation of any return 10% of your money? But yet that's what God tells us to do. And the reason that we see Him doing that is because we're acknowledging that God can do more with 90% than we can do on our own with 100%. It's kind of the same way with the Sabbath. When we talk about taking one day a week, it doesn't make a lot of sense that that is the way that you're going to be most successful. You're going to get more done by just not doing anything, not taking time to work and try to move forward and do these things. So in that way, it's kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's something that God says, hey, if you'll trust me to take this time and to give it back to me, then I'm going to honor that by making the rest of your time more productive. So we have to ask, do we trust that God can do more with our rested work than we can do on our own? Do we trust that, you know, by working during those other times of the week and giving it our effort and trusting God that we're going to be able to rest on the Sabbath, He's going to do more than we can do otherwise? A couple things about why it's so hard to rest. A little bit around overwork. So since the 1950s, our productivity has increased by about 400%. And when you think about all the advances we've had in technology, how much easier it is to communicate. You know, this morning I was on conference calls with folks over in the UK, and just at any given time we can do screen shares, we can, you know, connect with people online. There's just so much we can do, and the communication's so much faster. So our productivity has gone up, but the work hours haven't decreased. It's not that we're working less. Actually, if you look at it, the study here that I found said that 86% of male workers log more than 40 hours a week. And if you compare it to the 1970s, we're working on average 11 hours more per week than we did back then. So our work hours have increased. Yeah, our productivity has gone up, but more and more our culture is that we're just working more hours, and it leads to a lot of frustration and kind of burnout. And what will happen is you're working so hard and you're trying to get things done that you're overwhelmed. So even when you do take the time to rest, do you ever feel that feeling of, you know, kind of feeling like guilty? Like you feel like you can't really rest because there's just so much to do. So what's some of what's lost when this happens? Well, what happens is in our desire to gain more in the future, we often lose track of what we have here in the present. There's a story, one of the books, and I have this in the reference at the end, but one of the books that I read, and probably my favorite book in the subject, is by a Canadian author named Mark Buchanan. And the book's called The Rest of God. Like I said, I'll put a note here at the end as a resource. So, The Rest of God, and in this story, Mark tells the story about his wife's grandmother. Now, like I said, he was Canadian. I think he grew up in Western Canada. So his wife's grandmother was out in the garden one day, and as women often do, she was looking and she said, I think I can make this prettier. So she saw this big boulder in the garden, and she said, I'm going to polish the boulder. I'm going to make this thing shiny because it's kind of just this ugly rock sitting in my garden. So she goes and she gets some sandpaper or something, and she starts working on scrubbing on this thing. And she's going for a little while, and she kind of takes a step back to see how she's doing. And she notices that there's this fine bit of gold dust that's forming on this. And she starts to get excited because she says, you know, I'm in the western parts of the state. Is it possible that there's actually gold in this boulder? And maybe there's a whole gold mine here. So she starts to get excited and start thinking about all this. So she starts working harder, and she's scrubbing away with this and more, and she's seeing it, and she's going for quite a while. And then she kind of takes a step back to rest. And when she does, she notices that her wedding ring is feeling a little bit thin. And what had happened was she was working on that, and she was actually rubbing, and the gold that she found was she was rubbing away her ring. And it's kind of a sad story because what happened was she was so focused and starting to think about what she could have in the future that she almost destroyed what she had right there. But thankfully, because she took that moment to rest, that's when she was able to see what she was losing. That's when she was able to see that there was something that she was giving up now because she was so focused on what was going to happen in the future. So what will happen is our busyness, in our busyness, we often miss what God's trying to speak to us. We often miss what we have right now, and our focus is so much forward that we can lose it. We do this in a lot of different ways. It could be as simple as, what God's trying to speak to us and tell us to talk to somebody, or to form a relationship, or to give somebody an encouraging word. It could be spending time with our family, our kids, our spouse, whatever it is, that God's trying to tell us to do that. But when we're so focused on doing this work and the busyness, we can tend to lose track of those things. So it's important that we take that time out to rest, because we don't want to lose what we currently have. So I want to go through 3 things here that I think kind of keeps us from resting. What are some things that kind of drives us towards this busyness? And the first one that I want to talk about was status. And the statement that I'll say is that I think a lot of times our failure to rest is driven by our need to impress. We're so focused on trying to keep up with the Joneses and kind of have this image or this life that we imagine, that it's really hard for us to step back and just rest. And this is something that I've noticed. I told you guys over the last couple of weeks, where I grew up in Western New York was not people think New York, they think that there's money, but that's like a little part of New York. The rest of it's really poor. And where I grew up, I think the average income was $30-some thousand a year. And I came down here, and of course where we're at in Soutlake is a pretty affluent area. And you just kind of are in this microcosm of this wealth and success, and it becomes easy to start to kind of get caught up in that. And I'm a car guy, so I drive down the street and I see cars all over the place. That back home, like, if you drove that car, you turn every head. And down here, that's just kind of expected. So it becomes harder to be content with driving a nice car, because you need to drive a luxury car, right? So we're so focused sometimes on our need to impress and kind of achieve the status or keep up with what's around us, that it can drive us to work, and we're not really taking the time out to rest and be content with what God's given us right now. The second thing that I would say keeps us from resting is guilt. Like I said here at the beginning, that sometimes we're just so busy that you're trying to rest, but as soon as you take time to stop, you're just thinking about all those things that you need to get done, and you feel guilty about it, so you don't. You're trying to take time on the Saturday or a Sunday to kind of have a day of rest and Sabbath, but there's just so much to do around the house, or there's a place to go, or you got to catch up on some work that you don't want to have hanging over your head on Monday morning, and it's just this kind of guilt of like, well, if I rest, this stuff isn't going to get done. So the second thing that can kind of keep us from resting is guilt. The last one here that I would say is trust. And really more accurately, it would be a lack of trust. We talked about this verse a couple times in Matthew 6:33, where it says that if we seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, that all these other things, our need, will be added to us. But what happens is we often seek our needs first, and we seek his kingdom last. And we're so focused on trying to take care of something that God said that he would do. We're so focused on trying to fulfill our own needs through our own work that we're really doing an impossible task. We're doing a task that only God can do, that he promised that he would do. And in doing that, we're just going to burn ourselves out. But like I said, it takes trust to say, hey, I'm going to seek the kingdom, which means I'm going to set these things aside, and I'm going to do what he commanded. I'm going to rest, and I'm going to trust that he's going to provide for the needs. So when we have a lack of trust, it makes it really difficult for us to rest. God created us for relationship with him. He created us to be in relationship with him. And what happens is when we start to seek the work instead of the relationship, it's going to lead to a lot of heartache and destruction. So I wanted to take a minute here before we go on to some more stuff and see if there's anything else, and I'll pass around the handheld. Anything besides the 3 things that we talked about here that anyone has that they think is something that makes it difficult for them to rest? Don't be afraid because of the mic. Anybody? What are some things that cause you to have a hard time resting? Oh no, I should have given some more. There we go. What have you got? This is just for the audio.
I think some of it is addiction. Like you just get so used to working nonstop that when you do stop, you don't know how to stop. You know?
It's good. That's something we talked about last time on the social media, how we just have such a constant feed of information that it can be really hard to kind of disconnect from that.
I think sometimes it's hard to rest because we over-obligate ourselves,
Yep.
whether financially or commitments to others and family or people.
Yep.
So.
That's good. I like you said about financially. If we have debt, that makes it really difficult for us to take time to rest. Someone over here?
I would say with my job, sometimes the phrasing, the spirit of excellence from the Bible kind of takes a wrong turn for me, and it's not necessarily guilt or status, but I just want to make sure that I'm doing a good job.
Yep.
So sometimes I can feed into that a little bit too much.
Oh, I hear you. It's a good one. Anybody else? One more. What you got?
I think the kind of hours that we work, if we work at night, or we have to sleep different times than most people sleep.
That's a good one. Just different schedules, hard schedules. There's a lot of things that are tough. One more.
It goes to what he said, obligation, but really boundaries.
Yeah. What we talked about last week about, when you start to go through and talk about your schedule, there's no way you can fit it all in. And you need to be able to say no in order to put these things in. And this is something that when we talk about rest, it needs to be a priority. It needs to be something that we protect, and we're going to need to say no to some things in order to make sure we have the time. All right, another verse about how God is our rest. So it says in Psalm 62, verse 1 and 2, "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." So let's talk about two different views of time. And we're going to look at two different Greek words for time. And the first one here is a word called chronos. And, Pastor Robert loves to talk about the root words. And chronos, you can see an aspect of time in here, chronology or something like that. And chronos is a view of time that this was used to describe more as kind of like time as a devourer. And it's this idea of, these ticking seconds and minutes. And imagine that if you're trying to slow down this clock and you're striving to beat something, but no matter what you do, you can't stop it. And you start to kind of almost feel this sense of hopelessness, right? You're just like, this time's going by, and no matter what you do, you can't stop it, and the best you can do is just try to beat it, right? So it's this idea, just like you start to almost feel panicked when you start thinking about time as chronos. In Greek mythology, and I'm not using this as any sort of, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but the way that they viewed it, they had a god called Chronos. And Chronos is where we get the idea of father time. That's where they kind of think that came from. And the story goes that Chronos was so focused on trying to keep his power and kind of his kingdom that he made some sort of deal and he actually devoured his own children. So it's a pretty gruesome story. But the point is, we think about that and it's like, where did they come up with this stuff? But how easy is it for us to not really pay attention to our families because we're so focused on trying to get all these things done. And our family comes kind of at the end. So the idea here of chronos is you can remember, kind of think of it as desperation. But thankfully, there's another view of time. There's another word on time in the Greek, and this word is kairos. Kairos is the view of time as a gift. Think of it as like you're trusting God with the future and you're being fully present here in the now. Kairos allows us to be fully engaged because rather than thinking about time as something that we need to beat, we're just saying this is where God's put me right now. This is the time that He's given me. And I'm expectant and I'm just trusting Him that He's going to do something in this moment. Our freedom ministry events, Kairos 1 and 2, probably a lot of you have gone to those, are named Kairos. And it's this idea of this kind of anointed time where we're coming and we're expecting God to inhabit this time. And we're expecting Him to do something powerful. And that's kind of what, not just an approach to an event like Kairos, but this is a thought that we can have around time in general. That every time that we wake up and we say, God, what do you have for me today? Our approach isn't chronos, where we got to get so much done and try to beat it before the day gets by. But instead it's this idea of just resting in the peace and saying, God, thank you for the time that you've given me. and I'm just excited for what you're going to do in the moment. And worrying about, don't worry about the future, because God has that in his hands. So kairos is kind of equated to this idea of peace. In the Bible, I think there's a really good example of people who had kind of these two different views. And this is a story that a lot of you probably know. It's a story of Mary and Martha. And Mary and Martha, this story is in Luke 10 in the Gospels. Mary and Martha come a couple places in the Gospel. Their brother was Lazarus, who Jesus raised from the dead. And you can tell that these were good friends of Jesus. When he walked on the earth, these are people that he spent time with and he had a relationship with. And the story in Luke 10, it's in verse 38 where it picks up. And it talks about how Jesus is over at Mary and Martha's house. And he's spending some time with them. And Martha is doing what honestly I would probably be doing. She's running around and she's trying to get everything ready because, Jesus is there. And wherever Jesus went, you can imagine that there was a crowd. So I'm sure that there were people there and they were listening to him. And he was, talking and probably laughing and spending all this time. And Martha's back in the kitchen and she's running around and she's trying to get all this done. While her sister Mary was just sitting there and she was just listening to Jesus. And finally Martha comes out and she says, what, aren't you going to tell her to come help me? Look at all the stuff that I have to do. And when we pick up here in verse 42, we see what Jesus says to him. He says, Martha, Martha. Oh, sorry, one more click. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So what we see here is that, I think that Martha kind of had that idea that she needed to beat the time. She needed to get everything ready, and she was in this rushed, kind of desperate feeling. That was Martha's view, but Mary, she was looking at it as, hey, Jesus is here in my house. I get an opportunity to just be with him and to rest with him. And God talks about it, and he says, hey, look, it's okay. And what can happen is, we get so focused on the work that we're trying to serve God, when really that's not what God calls us to. Now, I put this one in, this was a part of a 2-week series I did on work. And I kind of expound more on this idea because I know that it might strike you a little bit and say, well, what do you mean, we're not called to work to God? Doesn't the Bible say that we're, do all things as unto the Lord? But my point here is that we're really called to work to serve others. Our work isn't to kind of earn anything from God, right? Our work is to serve others while we're here on earth. But what God's really called us to is relationship with him. So one of the things that I like to do, because I'm a big picture type guy, is I like to take a step back and kind of think about, if you look at the Bible from beginning to end, or you look at all that we know about time, and what was started is that, God's up there, and he's got the angels, and he's got the magnificence of heaven. He's got kind of everything. But what he wanted a relationship with us. He wanted people that could willfully be in relationship with him. So what he did was he creates Adam and Eve. And what we see is that before sin came, God came and he would actually walk in the garden with them. He had that relationship, that intimate relationship where he was actually walking with them in the garden and just being in that relationship. But then sin comes and enters the world when they disobeyed, and we have this period where man was separated from God. I mean, we see aspects in the Old Testament of where it was there, but kind of the whole Old Testament is a story of how Jesus is going to come and restore that relationship. So then he comes and he dies on the cross, and then it says that there's no longer, the veil's torn because no longer is there a separation between God and man. We can now be in relationship and communion because Jesus came and he took, and now we can have that relationship. But for the last 2,000 years, we still don't take advantage of that. How often is it that we forget about the fact that that's what the Bible's all about? It's the fact that God created us for a relationship with him. When that was broken, it's about the restoration. And yet we oftentimes put that as kind of the last thing. We get so focused on saying, but I don't have time to rest and to spend time with God because I have to do all these things for God. He's called me to this work or to this ministry or whatever it is, and we miss the very reason why he created us. So there's always going to be something more to do. There's always going to be something else that you have to do. So unless you prioritize rest, you won't achieve it. It's not your default state. Our tendency, especially I think here in American culture, where we're so performance driven and we put such a kind of a prize on a value on working hard and being diligent, that unless you make the priority to rest, it's not going to happen naturally. And I'm not talking about, this bad type of rest, if you will, like laziness, right? That will happen naturally. If you're not diligent, you'll just kind of fall off and be lazy. We saw that verse we talked about last week in Proverbs about, a little rest, a little sleep, a little folding of the hands. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being deliberate to say, I'm working here, but now I'm going to be intentional about pursuing rest. So that's what we need to do if we want to be in relationship with God. So what's the solution here? Well, God didn't intend for us to be focused here on the things of this world. Remember I said that one of the things that's lost when we don't rest is that we have a hard time hearing from God. What we want to be able to do is, like it says in Colossians 3:2, where it says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Rest allows us to kind of reflect and to hear those things. And there's a good example of this, and it's kind of this idea of margin. We need to regain this focus by allowing some level of what I call margin in our lives. I didn't really talk about this when we were talking about the scheduling in that last week, but one of the things that if you try to schedule every minute of your day, you're going to end up, everything's going to fall apart. And it's not that you don't schedule, but you have to schedule in some margin. You know that there's going to be things that are going to come up that you didn't plan, and you need to have that kind of time built in. Well, in the same type of way, we need to have some margin, some room in our lives. We need to have some rest. And what that allows us to do is hear from God. So I want to talk about another story, which happens to also be in Luke 10. They're unrelated, but this comes right before the story of Mary and Martha, and it's a story of the Good Samaritan. And the story of the Good Samaritan is a parable. We don't know if this happened exactly as it was told, but it's a parable about a guy who was going from Jerusalem down to Jericho. So he's traveling on this road, and the robbers come out, and they beat him up, and they toss him off to the side of the road. Well, what happens is a priest comes by, and he kind of sees him, and he goes to the other side of the road. And then a Levite comes by. So Levite, this guy is a real Jew, and he comes by, and he goes to the other side of the road. And then the third guy that comes by is a Samaritan. And the Samaritans, they were kind of the outcasts of the Jewish society. They were mixed. They weren't really Jews, so you weren't allowed to even talk to the Samaritans. But this guy sees the guy, and he comes and he picks him up. He takes him to a room, and he says, take care of him. Here's some money. Anything else you need, I'll pay for it when I get back. Well, the reason I bring up this story is because I think that, this guy here in Luke 10:33, we see the end of the story. It says, when he traveled, he came and saw who the man was, and he took pity on him. So several years ago, a university did a study kind of around this parable. And they took kind of a modern day piece of it. This was, I think, a Christian university or a seminary. And they had some seminary students, and they broke them into 3 different groups. And they're sitting on one side of the campus, and they tell the first group, they tell all 3 of them, they say, we want you to go to the other side of the campus and teach a sermon or a teaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan, the story we just talked about. So these guys knew it. They were seminary students. They understood this in their head. But the difference is they broke them into 3 groups. In the first group, they said, we want you to go teach them, and by the way, you're already running late. People are waiting for you. You need to get there right away because, you got to get there and teach this. So they were in a hurry. The second group, they took and they said, hey, if you leave now, you should be able to make it. You're not late, but you got to make sure you're prompt. Get there on time. It's starting soon. And then the third group, they said, you got plenty of time. The class doesn't start here for a little bit, so take your time getting over there. Then what they did was between where they were and where they needed to go, they took and they put a guy in the hallway all slumped over. Looked like, something had happened. I don't know, maybe he had had a heart attack or something, but the guy wasn't in good shape. So they put him there, and what they wanted to see is how the impact of how rushed these 3 groups were on how they treated this guy. And sure enough, what they found is the first group that thought that they were already running late, they literally stepped right over the guy. I don't think any of them stopped to help him. The second group, a couple of them I think did. A couple of them said, hey, I got to hurry, but this is important. It wasn't until you get to the third group that knew that they had some more time that they were the ones that more of them stopped and helped them. So the point here is that if we are just have the knowledge of the story of the Good Samaritan, but if we don't build into our lives some aspect of margin and rest, we're not going to be able to stop and really see the opportunities that God's putting here. So part of the study here, and I don't expect you to write down the whole link, but you can find the whole study online. It says, ironically, a person in a hurry is less likely to help people, even if he's going to speak in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Some literally stepped over the victim on their way to the next building. The results seem to show that thinking about norms does not imply that one will act on them. Maybe that ethics has become a luxury as the speed of our daily life increases, or maybe people's cognition was narrowed in the hurriedness and they failed to make immediate connection of the emergency. I would like to think that I would do something different. I'd like to think that, if I was in that situation, or maybe if it's just as simple as, I'm driving down the road and I see someone that's on the side of the road and needs help changing their tire, I'd like to think I'd be the person that would stop. But the reality is, when I'm so focused on getting there, I don't have any sort of margin built into my life and my schedule, a lot of times I won't even see that opportunity, much less take the time to stop. So it's important that, we don't just understand this concept, but we have some aspect of rest and trust in our lives so we're able to take advantage and see those things when they come along. So the other piece I wanted to have here is looking and saying, what did Jesus do in his time? What can we do to mimic Jesus? And there's two things that I think we see with Jesus. Now, I talked about in week 1 about how I think it's crazy that Jesus, his views on time are different than ours. He waited 30 years to even start his ministry, and then he only had 3 years that he really focused on it. And what we see is even during those 3 years, he was very rhythmic in his approach. He was you never see where Jesus looked to be hurried. I mean, Lazarus died and he showed up 4 days late. Like, he was not in a hurry. And we see that, even at the peak of his ministry, he would have this massive success, right? He would have this huge group of people. And then afterwards, he would just draw away to be with the Father and to pray. So he prioritized this rest and this relationship even during the peak part of his ministry. So he was very rhythmic. He was very not unintentional. Obviously, there's nothing about him that was lazy, but we don't see this aspect of where he was rushed, even though he only had essentially 3 years to change the course of history, to do this thing that was just impossible in our minds. How could this happen? And he just waits 30 years, does it in 3 years, and then says, peace be with you. Second thing is Jesus was relational. So relationships take time. Relationships take time. Time takes focus. He invested in people to further his ministry. He didn't focus on process. He didn't focus on saying, how can I build up this big structure and make sure that everything's there and in place before I leave? What he did was he took the time that he was here and he pretty much just invested in the people, his disciples around him. And I think one of the things that we see is that, even Jesus, when you look at who he had in his kind of inner circle, he had the 12 disciples, but really among those, he really had 3 that were his good friends. And I don't know about you, but I find that that's probably about my limit. I mean, I figure if that's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. That's about my limit of people that you can really be in close connection and relationship with at any given time. Now, he had the next group of people. So these might be the people that, you know them well. These are people that you may see, on a weekly basis or even, a monthly basis or something. So there's a group of people that he knew well. And then we see that there was this other people, like we talked about with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, where yes, there was other people. I've seen a study somewhere that said that, those numbers kind of pan out, that we can have about 2 or 3 really good friends at any given point. There's about a dozen close friends that we can have, and you really can't know more than maybe 150 people. At any given point, once you get beyond about 150, you really don't know much about them, right? I know you may have more Facebook friends than that, but it's hard to really know more than that amount of people. And I think that that's something that's important for us to realize, because if Jesus was focused on relationship, we need to understand that takes time. And you can't be, best friends with everybody. You need to take and devote the time. But that's what's really important. That's what takes and builds a ministry. So if you want to do the kingdom work, a lot of times it's not about doing the work and focusing on building the process or teaching the class or whatever it is that God may have called you to. Sometimes the biggest thing you can do is just take the time to be in relationship with some people and to really focus on building that. And it may not seem like you're doing anything that productive, but literally that's what Jesus did in his time. When he left, that's when he left. He left it in the hands of these 11 disciples, really, right? Because Judas had betrayed him. And those were the ones that took and built everything. They carried out the message of the gospel afterwards. So never be afraid to take the time for relationships. All right, moving on to how to rest. A couple things here that I think are important if we're going to do rest or the Sabbath well. And the first thing is we need to remember that rest or the Sabbath is not a duty. The Bible says here in Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, when I first started preparing for this class a year and a half ago when I taught it, I was kind of surprised as I was reading how many people had this view of the Sabbath that was just this really it was like Sunday was not a good time. This was the time that you weren't allowed to do anything, you weren't allowed to go outside. It was very buttoned up. You kept your church clothes on all day, and it just wasn't an enjoyable thing. And I'm thankful that where I grew up, it wasn't really like that. It was just a good day of rest. We watched football, and I would make spaghetti, and it was just it was a nice day. But I realized that there's a lot of people, maybe from different denominational backgrounds or family backgrounds, that their idea of the Sabbath isn't something that's restful, but it's more of a duty. And I think it's important that we realize that that's not really what God intended. So what brings you rest is the question that you should ask. So much of the Sabbath is kind of around this idea of just doing nothing. And I've never been to Israel. I'd love to go sometime, but I've heard from people that go that if you go there and it's on the Sabbath and you go to use an elevator, there's going to be a bunch of people that will line up behind you. And the reason they do that is the elevators go into Sabbath mode. So they're not allowed to push the buttons to which floor they want to go. So when you get on the elevator on the Sabbath, it's programmed to stop at every floor, because that way you can get off when your floor comes. So what they'll do is they get behind you, because then they get on and they say, could you go to 7, please? So that you can push the button for them. So there's such this idea of religion. I'm not saying that to make fun of any Orthodox Jews or anything. I'm just saying that this idea of the Sabbath with you can't do anything. It needs to be so focused on just don't do any work, that I think we kind of miss the point that we're not here to have this duty or obligation. So what is it that brings rest to you? If it's something that you say, I like watching football, don't feel guilty about that. If that's what brings you rest on a Sabbath or a Sunday, or whatever day that it is that you take that time, feel free to do that. If it's going fishing or spending time with your family, going to the park, whatever it may be, enjoy it and embrace it rather than look at it as just a duty and something that you need to follow in a certain religious way. Part of doing this is recognizing that the Sabbath, our rest, is a gift from God. Matthew 11:28 says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden." So God tells us to come to him. And I think that part of what we need to realize is that, right from the very beginning, in the creation of the world, that God rested. We see where it says, for 6 days God created the world, and then it says on the 7th day he rested. So what I would challenge you with is, if God rested, we know it wasn't because he was tired, right? He was God. I don't think that God can get tired. And yet he took that time. So why did he do that? Well, I think what he was trying to do was model for us how he wanted us to live our lives, right? And he was saying that it's okay to do that. So I never want you to feel that rest is a sign of some sort of weakness. When you rest, it's not because you're weak, but it's because God is strong. When you rest, it's not because you can't do anymore. It's because God, from the very beginning, intended that you would work hard, but then you would take that time and you would rest. And that's what he did, because it's a gift that he gives us. And we're able to do that because of who he is. So just receive it and just recognize it. Thank God for it. And just take it and say, I'm humbled by the fact that God's given this to me. I'm just going to accept it. I'm not going to worry about whether I earned it or anything like that. And you just take that time. So I would encourage you to remove this judgment and this expectation from your rest. Whatever it is that brings you rest. If you like to get out in nature, read, watch a movie, whatever it is, embrace that. Don't take this preconceived notion of what it needs to look like because God really wants to have something that brings refreshment to you. And secondly, we rest because of Christ's completed work, not our own. I think this is really important as well. If you feel the pressure, like I said, to always, you can only rest when you get everything done, you're never going to get everything done. There's always going to be something more to do. And it's amazing how just like when you decide that you're going to tithe, that somehow it all works, right? Somehow God comes and he gets within that and he says, I'm going to make this work. Well, in the same way, when we recognize that, you know what, God said, Jesus said that it is finished. And of course, we know what he was talking about in that he was saying it was finished and he's bringing that restoration. But that also means that there's no aspect of where we need to work anymore for God's favor. We're not working and striving for that. So we can now rest because God, he already did all that. So what we can do is just realize that we don't need to have this, have everything done. And that's why I think that when I talk about how Sabbath is similar to the tithe in the aspect of is trusting God, I think there's also an aspect of the first fruits. The concept of the first fruits is that the tithe isn't just 10%, but it's the first 10%. Well, if you're thinking rest, rest is a little bit different, right? Because time is always moving along. So it's like, where do we call the beginning and the end? But the point is, it's kind of a first fruit because you need to say, at this moment that I have right now, I'm going to give it to God and say that I'm trusting and he's going to take care of it, right? Even though you don't know. One of the things that I'm working on outside of my day job is working on starting a business on the side. And as you start to kind of look at this culture of entrepreneurship or whatever it is, there's this whole, kind of movement and a lot of people that think about it. And their tendency oftentimes tends to be, well, I'm going to work, 80 hours a week now so that I can do whatever I want later, right? And it's this idea that, like, I'm just going to sacrifice and do what it takes because then I'll be able to do more later. And sometimes it's kind of like we think about our money, right? We say, well, if I give this money now, then I'm not going to be able to invest it. But if I invest it, then I'm going to be able to give God more later. Would you really think it's our responsibility to say, I need to do all this stuff, now and make it happen so that later I can give more to God? No, we need to say that even though I may be trying to start a business and it would make sense to work all day on Sunday on that, I need to say, no, it's okay that I'm going to take and trust that if God wants me to have a business, he'll do it in his time. But right now, he's giving me this time, and I need to rest and be in a relationship with him and with others. So I would encourage you that, don't get caught up in that idea, well, it's just for a little while. It's just for a little bit longer that I'm going to be doing this, and then I'm going to be able to take the time out to rest, because it never really ends. So last thing here, the struggle to rest. So first of all, I want you to remember and recognize that your rest will be opposed. When you try to rest, just like if you decide that you're going to tithe, probably the first week that you say, you know what, I haven't been giving, I'm going to give more, I'm going to tithe, you're probably going to have the washing machine break, or you're going to need something happens in the car, or whatever, because Satan doesn't want us to have this. Like Pastor Robert talked about last week, the reason that God has given us the tithe is not for his benefit, but for our benefit, right? So Satan wants to keep that from you in the same way with rest. See, what happens is when we start to rest, when we have a restful heart, it leads to the presence of God. When we start to have a heart that's just rested and in tune with what God's saying, that's where he can start to come in and be there. And that's the last thing that Satan wants. So recognize that when you start to try to rest, you're going to have more things come in. Those boundaries are going to become even more important because you're really going to need to protect that. So Satan doesn't want us to know God, so he's going to oppose our rest. So you got to realize that the attacks, even the good ones, even the things that may seem to be good, like when someone asks you to do something, serve in a ministry at the church or whatever, you got to understand that sometimes those things can be bad. Those can be Satan trying to pull you away because he doesn't want you to start to have this rested heart that's really in tune with what God has for you. So be aware of this. As you start to walk out of here, I hope that your commitment is that you will take time to rest, and I want you to be aware of the fact that it's going to be difficult, and you really need to keep those priorities. So we're almost wrapped up here. I'm just going to do a final slide on closing, but I wanted to just take another round of questions here, or not questions, but comments. Here's what do you find to be the most restful? We talked about how, I said maybe looking out in nature or whatever. What are some things that you all find that are what you find to be the most restful?
I like to travel.
Travel. Travel's not restful. That's a horrible one. Who else? No, some travel is.
I like to run.
You like to, oh, you guys have horrible ones. We need something better than this. Anybody else? I think I had another question I was going to ask you guys. All right, what do you find that most opposes your rest? What are some of the things, whether maybe good things or bad things, that you find that kind of come in and eat up your time? We talked about some things earlier that they can make it tough, but what are some other things that, you know, kind of creep into your time that you set aside to rest? Anything in particular? About a year ago, I had a bunch of friends that were having, like, all their kids are having 1-year birthday parties, and I thought, how do people keep up with all these 1-year-old birthday parties? That was it for a while, but thankfully they're all 2 now, and at that point, like, they just forget. They're like, oh, our kid, actually, one of them, their kid just turned 1. It was like the 3rd one. They're like, yeah, it turned 1. I was like, no party? They're like, no. Okay.
I would say too many friends and phone calls.
Too many friends. I wish I had that problem. I don't have any friends. I don't know what she's talking about. Did you have one?
I would say unanticipated problems with vehicles, houses, everything.
Yeah.
It'll get you.
Stuff comes up.
Good morning.
You got one. All right.
Sometimes your kids' obligations.
Kids obligations.
They're involved in that. You have to help them out.
Oh man. All right. So don't have. I'm taking notes here. Don't have kids. Don't have friends. This class is better for me than it is for you. All right. Very good. Let's go ahead, and we are going to close here with just a couple recap statements. Hold on. Keep doing this. There we go. So a couple things we covered today. One, we rest because of Jesus. Rest is not due to our weakness, but it's because of His strength. So be encouraged and to just accept that, because it's not something that that's because of us, but we do it because of Him. Secondly, rest is a gift from God. We rest because of His finished work, not our own. And then the third concept I want you to walk away with is that the Sabbath is whatever brings us rest. It's not a set of rules. So we go to close out here. Just some additional resources. I always like to put things up there. 2 books that I read in preparation for this. I talked about The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan. One of the things I really like about this book is kind of the style that it's written in. A lot of times, I think a lot of books that we have these days are kind of very like, they try to grab your attention, right? This one kind of fits, the style fits the topic. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's just a very like, it's almost poetic in the way he wrote it. It's just a very easy book to read, and I think it fits really well with the style. Then the other one here came out a few years ago by Pastor Brady Boyd, who's up in Colorado, but used to be here at Gateway, called Addicted to Busy. And it talks about, you know, our culture and about how we have so many things. Talks about the obligations with the kids, saying no, things like that. So this one's a really easy read as well. So I encourage you to check out either of those if you're interested to read more on the topic. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close in prayer. And then I purposely left some extra time here so if you guys want to talk afterwards, I'll be around. So dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you so much for the folks that came here tonight and for the last couple weeks here to talk about stewarding your time, stewarding our time, the time that you've given us, Lord God. So I pray that for each person that's here, that they walk out of here with a commitment to steward time well and to apply some of the practical things. But God, also hear that one of the first things that they put as their priority is to rest, Lord. And I pray that as they take that time to rest, that they build that into their daily and weekly schedules, God, that you would come and you would have that time. That would be a Kairos time, that it would be something that you would come and your presence would be there, that you would be with them, God, that you would speak to them, Lord, that you would start to do things in each person that's here, that you would start to do things in their life, Lord God, because they take the time to steward what you've given them and to rest and just trust in you. Pray it all in your name, Lord God. Amen. All right. Thank you very much.